this webinar today with MPA News, a service of Octo, with the EBM Tools Network, which is co-coordinated by Octo and NatureServe, and with Open Channels, a service of Octo. So with us today are Brian Baird, the former chair of the Marine Protected Areas Federal Advisory Committee, Samantha Murray with the Scripps Institution of Oceanography, Mark Carr with University of California, Santa Cruz, and Charles Wally with NOAA's MPA Center. Our speakers will be leading us through the presentation, Sustaining MPA Benefits in a Changing Ocean, a call to action from the Marine Protected Areas Federal Advisory Committee. Thanks to all of you for sharing your work with our audience. I'll introduce you in a moment, but first I want to remind you all on the line, on the internet, that this is an hour-long webinar. We'll have the presentations and then allow plenty of time for questions and comments, so please use the chat or the Q&A functions in your webinar interface to provide your questions so that we can have a conversation about these ideas following the presentations. So to introduce our speakers, in addition to his former chairmanship of the MPA Federal Advisory Committee, Brian Baird is an ocean and coastal policy advisor and serves as president of the Coastal States Stewardship Foundation. He previously directed the Ocean and Coastal Program at the Bay Institute in San Francisco and served for 18 years as the Assistant Secretary for Ocean and Coastal Policy under California Governors Brown, Schwarzenegger, Davis, and Wilson. Brian received formal recognition of his ocean protection work from the California State Legislature and the California Congressional Delegation in 2011. Samantha Murray is faculty at the Scripps Institution of Oceanography, where she is also the executive director of an interdisciplinary master's program in marine biodiversity and conservation. She has nearly 2 decades of experience in conservation and has directed ocean and water programs at the Ocean Conservancy, the Audubon Society, and the Oregon Environmental Council. Samantha also founded an ocean policy consulting business where she works with clients on issues related to water quality, ocean acidification, habitat protection, and climate change. And she played a key role in the design and implementation of California's network of marine protected areas, which now cover 16% of state waters. Next, we have Mark Carr, who's a professor of marine ecology in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology at UC Santa Cruz. His research focuses on the ecology of coastal marine fishes and coastal marine ecosystems and includes the design and evaluation of marine protected areas. For 8 years, Mark served as co-chair of the science advisory team to California's Marine Life Protection Act, which culminated in the establishment of the statewide network of marine protected areas. He is now involved in the design and implementation of the monitoring and evaluation program of California's MPA network and is a founding principal investigator with the Partnership for Interdisciplinary Studies of Coastal Oceans. And lastly, Charles Wally serves as the senior scientist for NOAA's National MPA Center and as the designated federal officer for the MPA Federal Advisory Committee. A coral reef ecologist with over 4,000 hours underwater conducting research, Charlie's work at NOAA now focuses on bringing sound science into the design, creation, and adaptive management of the nation's MPAs. He has also led science and policy programs in the National Marine Sanctuary System and the National Estuarine Research Reserve System, and has played key roles in the creation of the MPA Executive Order and NOAA's Coral Reef Conservation Program. So again, a warm welcome to our speakers and to you, our audience. And I'll now turn the presentation over to Charlie, who will begin our webinar today.
Thanks, Roldan, and to my fellow speakers and the audience for joining us. And thank you for your interest in the MPA Federal Advisory Committee. I'm going to just give a quick introduction and then hand it over to our committee members to tell you their story. The outline of today's presentation is a brief overview of the committee and its roles and functions in NOAA and in Department of Interior, followed by an overview of the committee's deliberations for the 2018 charge, and then followed by Samantha Murray and Mark Carr describing what the committee found about the diverse benefits of MPAs and the challenges that face them and their recommendations for how to sustain those benefits over time. And then finally, Brian and I will wrap up with some closing thoughts. Next slide, please. So this is the story of the MPA Advisory Committee. It advises the U.S. Departments of Commerce and Interior on ways to enhance the design, establishment, and adaptive management of MPAs in U.S. waters. So that's federal, state, tribal, and local. But principally, the recommendations are focused primarily on the federal side. It was authorized by a presidential executive order in 2000. It's created under the Federal Advisory Committee Act, which has its own set of policies and procedures that we have to follow. It's been reauthorized by the White House consistently since 2000 and is up for reauthorization later this year. And it's managed on a day-to-day basis by the NOAA's MPA Center. The committee has 20 members that represent very diverse ocean interests, ranging from recreational scuba diving to sport fishing, commercial fishing, cultural heritage, tribal interests, and heavy industry and everything in between. The members work collaboratively toward consensus solutions, which then are articulated in their recommendations. And we are currently in the midst of recruitment for 11 new members for the 2019 term. Importantly, the committee's deliberations are guided by a charge that's given to them usually every 2 years by the Secretaries of Commerce and Interior. So it's essentially the departments or the client, and they're requesting that the committee give them specific information about timely and important topics. The committee's recommendations are independent products created by them and are submitted directly to the two departments with no formal agency review or approval. So that everything you hear from the committee today and you see in their recommendations or in any other products are their own thoughts and are have not been adjusted in any way by the departments. So I think that's it for the committee. I'll hand it over now to Brian.
Thank you, Charlie. First off, I want to thank all the participants in this webinar this morning. I understand that over 250 people signed up for this discussion. That's pretty impressive. I'd also like to thank our committee members who donated so much of their time for the betterment of our ocean, and without their commitment and hard work, this effort would not be possible. So now on to our committee work. The Secretaries of Commerce and Interior gave our committee a charge regarding two topics. The first is to identify the benefits of U.S. marine protected areas to marine ecosystems, economies, and communities. That resulted in the report we're discussing today, Sustaining Marine Protected Area Benefits in a Changing Ocean. That was a product of groups throughout our entire committee and unanimously adopted. The other effort dealt with enhancing our efforts with cultural heritage resources, which was done by a working group, but also adopted by the full group. We are not discussing that item today. Our committee scoped and adopted our charge at a public meeting in San Francisco in 2018, which included our entire committee, but also included experts from throughout the country. And it was clear that we needed to break this up into some themes. And so we developed teams for different components of the charge, such as benefits to ecosystems, benefits to economies, benefits to cultures, and benefits, or not benefits, but and just the challenges that we face. We're very pleased that Dr. Mark Carr from UC Santa Cruz, who will be speaking today, produced a supplemental report on benefits to ecosystems, citing 100 different publications in their analysis of how these MPAs affect ecosystems. And Samantha Murray from Scripps Institution of Oceanography will be discussing the overall breadth of the report, the more details. I'm just giving you the overview. Our committee products were reviewed online. We had lots of public input, meetings where people could call in and ask us questions, et cetera, et cetera. Everything was approved unanimously. And then I had the privilege of submitting the document to both the Secretaries of Commerce and Secretaries of Interior. Next slide. So beginning to talk about the findings of the report, we found that marine protected areas can provide widespread, substantial, and lasting benefits throughout our local economies and our regional economies and communities and our ecosystems and our cultures. And we did have a lot of discussion about the fact that marine protected areas contribute to these benefits. Obviously, a marine protected area is not the sole reason these benefits occur, but there definitely is a linkage and some connectivity. Second point is documenting the emerging challenges to marine protected area effectiveness. And those challenges are things like climate change or the various human uses that are going to be proposed within a marine protected area, and also recent policy shifts. And on the policy shifts, I should say that there were 2 presidential executive orders to evaluate the potential for oil and gas activities in protected waters, waters that prohibited these activities. We hope that the administration carefully considers the benefits identified in this report before rendering any decisions, and they're very important decisions, on any modifications to those areas. We have, as a result of our efforts, we provided the Secretaries of Commerce an Interior and Action agenda to help us deal with these ecosystem and policy challenges. And keep in mind, this is for the benefit of all of us around today, but really, this is for future generations. Next slide, please. So now on to our action agenda. There are 5 major things I'll cover, and Samantha will get into much more detail about how all this occurred. But based on the benefits of our marine protected areas, our committee is sending forth the recommendation that the federal government maintain and support the nation's system of marine protected areas. And a key component of that is to ensure that any proposed alterations to a marine protected area are based on rigorous science and extensive public processes, basically using the same process that created them. If you're going to modify them, you need the same rigorous science and community involvement. Our second point is compatibility of ocean uses in today's MPAs. Our managers need to constantly be vigilant about what is compatible and what is not, and that requires support of the federal government. Third is providing sufficient compliance with MPA rules. And there are various tools for that. This says enforcement, which is important, but I believe personally and I think the committee believes, that education and enforcement. Education can be the best tool for compliance around, but if that's not working, then we need enforcement to be sure this is all working. Our fourth point is working with communities to improve marine protected area effectiveness. We identified community-based groups throughout the nation who have stepped up to the plate because they care about these resources. The one I'm personally most familiar with is the Marine Protected Area Collaborative here in California. But these organizations exist throughout the nation, and thank God they are willing to volunteer their time usually to help. But we need to support them. And finally, it's all about science, and we need to have the best available science to adapt to what all the science community is telling us. We have a changing ocean. This is going to change the way we manage our marine protected areas, and we need to have the best available science to do that. All right, that concludes my overview. What I'm going to do is turn this over now to Samantha Murray from the Scripps Institution of Oceanography, and she's going to run through a little more detail on the report.
Thank you, Brian, and thanks, Charlie. So this graphic sort of illustrates the fact that, well-designed MPAs that are actively managed, enforced, monitored, and evaluated not only protect ecologically important species and processes, but they also provide tangible and lasting economic, community, and cultural benefits, as well as ecological benefits. And this is both inside MPAs and beyond MPA boundaries. So we're going to talk today about some of the ways that MPAs, particularly in the US, can realize this potential. Next slide, please. So the first benefit we're going to discuss is the benefit to coastal communities and economies. The United States, nearly 1,200 MPAs do much more than just conserve important natural habitats and species within their boundaries. Increasingly, these critical ocean places and the human activities they support are also becoming sort of woven into the fabric of local coastal economies and cultures. So here we have, 6 diverse examples of how MPAs can benefit coastal communities and their visitors. We're only really going to talk about the first 3, but if you look at our full report, which can be found on the MPAFAC website, you can read about, some of these other factors as well. Next slide, please. So the first under this benefit is ocean recreation and tourism. So think scuba diving, boating, kayaking, wildlife watching, recreational fishing. These activities are undeniably growing in many areas of the US, and the money spent on these activities and the associated services are an important contributor to coastal communities. These kinds of recreation draw visitors from near and far who pay for a variety of local services like charters and guides, outfitters, equipment vendors, restaurants, lodging, transportation, and entertainment. And many US coastal areas also happen to contain MPAs, which are often home to, the ecosystems that are drawing visitors to these coastal areas. So coral reefs and kelp forests and submarine canyons and wetlands, estuaries, and the Great Lakes. And then, of course, MPAs also preserve cultural landmarks and heritage like shipwrecks or sacred sites for the benefit of current and future generations. So we want to be really clear in saying that documenting the relative contributions of specific MPAs to coastal economies can be challenging. And we certainly would welcome and recommend additional studies of these benefits and costs of MPAs. But what we do know is that it's clear that ocean tourism and recreation thrive on healthy, productive, and inviting ecosystems, such as those maintained in MPAs. So one example, which is not shown here specifically, but in 2011, the Willapa National Wildlife Refuge had 115,000 visits. And this translated to $2.6 million of the local economic effects associated with these visits, 21 jobs, and nearly $720,000 in employment income, and $311,000 in total tax revenue. And that's just one MPA. Similarly, there was an economic assessment of Michigan's Thunder Bay National Marine Sanctuary, which indicated an income in 2015 of $42 million, and the sanctuary had 93,000 visits. So you can see some of these other national marine sanctuaries bulleted out here and similar benefits based on economic assessments of these sanctuaries. And certainly there are other examples from South Florida, Hawaii, and California, which all have significant coastal and ocean economies driven by tourism and also happen to be home to significant MPA coverage. Next slide, please. So the next one we wanted to touch on was sustainable recreational fishing. So many MPAs permit and in fact even advertise and promote recreational fishing. And MPA managers sometimes partner with user groups and businesses to share best practices for sustaining ecosystems and fishing together. Sustainable fishing opportunities are available at more than 270 national wildlife refuges, and it's a valuable economic contributor, supporting over 828,000 jobs in the US. Anglers spend over $48 billion annually on equipment, licenses, trips, and other fishing-related events. And over time, the hope is that the engagement efforts by US MPAs will not only help generate local revenue from this popular activity, but also contribute to the long-term sustainability and stewardship of America's MPAs by engaging and getting the support from the recreational fishing community. Next slide, please. So the third thing we wanted to touch on under this benefit is building local coastal management capacity. Most MPs really focus within their boundaries on managing the natural or cultural resources within, but many are increasingly looking outward as well. For example, many US MPAs present public lectures, workshops, festivals intended to inform residents and visitors about locally relevant environmental issues. A good example of this is NOAA's National Estuarine Research Reserve System, You can see the statistic here, but they regularly host professional trainings for local resource managers at 28 different reserve sites. And since its inception in 1988, over 200,000 coastal professionals have been trained in approximately 5,000 workshops in these estuary and MPAs. And they touch on issues identified by local user needs, like coastal restoration and living shorelines, how to manage visitor use in MPAs, coastal flooding, blue carbon, and more. So there really is a sort of forward-facing external value as well in terms of education from these MPAs. Next slide, please. So the second sort of big bucket of benefits that we wanted to cover, and that we do cover in our report, is the fact that MPAs really do connect America's people to their heritage. We identified 4 distinct ways that MPAs do this, and we're just going to sort of touch on the first 3. Next slide. So the first one is celebrating America's maritime heritage. Many federal and state MPAs encompass more than just ecosystems. They also protect physical artifacts of cultures that have been historically connected to America's coast and Great Lakes. So this can range from shipwrecks to Native American villages in New England, to coastal dwellings built by escaped slaves in the Southeast, to towns built by Chinese immigrants to California. And they all tell really powerful and compelling stories of life at the interface between land and sea. And these MPAs are providing an avenue for the celebration, continuation, and renewal of traditional cultural ways. Next slide. Engaging Indigenous and Native American communities. So 2 big ways that MPAs can contribute to this. One is in the MPA planning processes. MPA planning processes can provide effective venues for partnering with Indigenous communities and Native American tribes who have been stewards of our coastlines since time immemorial. And so it's only appropriate that they be engaged in the place-based management of ocean environments. And the second way is that protections provided by MPAs have also created opportunities for federal and state government to uphold a trust responsibility and respect the government-to-government relationship, which has sometimes led to co-management and even monitoring of resources. So in terms of the planning process, there are a few examples that we identify in our report. One is in Santa Barbara, California, where the Chumash and other Indian tribes have brought together lots of different communities and stakeholders in support of a potential new national marine sanctuary. Chumash records indicate that these sites down off of Santa Barbara were occupied by Native Americans for up to 18,000 years, and they represent significant cultural value to local tribes. So if designated, this would be the first US national marine sanctuary created expressly to protect tribal heritage, which is significant. Similarly, in the California MPA, state MPA process, tribes played a very significant role in shaping the way that that process unfolded. Although the original planning effort did not include a distinct role or consultation with tribes, the process eventually led to several very positive outcomes, including California cabinet level tribal liaison, a California Fish and Game Commissioner, an established tribal committee, and monitoring by tribes of the state MPAs. And then when you think about the actual protections offered by MPAs and ongoing opportunities for engagement, we identified Native Hawaiians in the management of Papahanaumokuakea National Marine Monument. The monument's Native Hawaiian Cultural Working Group provides a forum for discussion and engagement around cultural aspects of place-based management. Next slide, please. So supporting citizen science. Many MPAs provide opportunities for people to engage in citizen science, which can help inform site management. So the example you see here is in Chesapeake Bay National Estuary and Research Reserve, where thousands of children and adults are engaging in hands-on citizen science in the lab and in the MPA habitats themselves. They get trained in data collection, and these science efforts have recreated a robust and useful 15-year data set on economically and socially important species that really match the scientific integrity of data collected by fish biologists. So fishery managers in Maryland, Delaware, and Virginia have been able to use this information to better understand species like herring, shad, and yellow and white perch, as well as to conserve their habitats. Next slide. So now I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Mark Carr, who led the creation of the supplemental report on resilient ecosystems, to talk about benefit number 3.
Great. Hey, thanks, Samantha. So the ecosystem team generated 4 key conclusions that we submitted to the Secretaries of Interior and Commerce. The first is that MPAs support the restoration of degraded habitats, which I'll expand briefly on in the following slide. The second is that MPAs can sustain and enhance marine ecological communities, largely by imparting or increasing the resistance and resilience to both natural disturbances, such as hurricanes, or anthropogenic or human-caused disturbances like oil spills. The third, which was revealed by our evaluation, was that protected marine communities can resist the invasion of exotic species, including those that are expanding their ranges in response to a changing climate. And then finally, we thought it important to recognize that MPAs also allow scientists to detect and understand these impacts by fostering research within individual MPAs. So with respect to restoration, the first point is that MPAs can foster the restoration of ecosystems such as oyster beds, coral reefs, salt marshes, and even make mandates and missions for those restoration efforts and provide financial and research support. And an excellent example of this is the system of national estuarine research reserves that not only contribute to the restoration, but actually study those restoration processes to inform other efforts around the country. The ecosystem benefits team specifically explored whether MPAs can enhance ecosystem resilience, and if so, based on what design and management criteria to better inform best management practices to enhance that resilience. So to explore this, we reviewed over 100 published studies from around the world, and we evaluated the evidence for MPAs enhancing both ecological resistance and resilience. And so what I mean by resistance is the capacity of a system, whether it's an individual organism, a population, a community, or a whole ecosystem, to remain intact when it's exposed to some either natural or human-caused disturbance. Resilience, on the other hand, is the ability of a system to recover or rebound from a disturbance, having been initially altered in some way. So it's important to recognize, excuse me, let me back up there. It's important to recognize that it's difficult to and it's also rare to observe ecological resilience. And this is simply because it requires a long time series of information, both prior to and after a given disturbance. And there's simply very few studies that are of sufficient duration to capture these system responses to these disturbances. However, there's well-known mechanisms, ecological mechanisms of resilience. For example, larger populations are more resilient than smaller populations. Communities with greater species diversity are known to be more resilient than less diverse systems. And also ecosystems that are more productive have been shown to be more resilient and resistant to disturbances. So what we can do is we can ask whether MPAs impart or enhance any of these ecological mechanisms for resistance or resilience. So what we found is that in fact there is growing evidence for the enhancement of resistance and resilience of populations, communities, and ecosystems by the presence of an MPA. The literature also indicates that the best management practices to foster resilience include well-enforced MPAs, older MPAs that have been around for longer periods, larger MPAs, no-take reserves, especially those that include multiple ecosystems within them, and those that are part of an ecologically based network of marine protected areas. We also realize, though, the lack of and need for longer-term monitoring studies to resilience to these disturbances. And then I'll close by reminding people that resilience is what allows ecosystems to continue to provide ecosystem services, whether they're fisheries or recreation, well into the future. And it's back to you, Samantha.
Thanks, Mark. So recognizing these three categories of benefits, these three broad categories of benefits, we also recognize that there are very real emerging challenges that may threaten these MPA benefits. Many of America's MPAs are several decades old, with some dating back over a century. And a lot has changed since their initial design and establishment. Coastal populations have grown, human uses of the ocean have grown, and climate-driven changes in ocean conditions are increasingly evident and pervasive. So as a result, today's MPAs strive to adaptively manage a complex and dynamic seascape that is increasingly altered from the scene that led to the original conservation measures. So we've got some photos here to sort of symbolize some of the emerging challenges that we identified, but broadly they include, number one, a growing ocean tourism and recreational uses. Number two, expanding industrial and commercial uses, and these sort of include offshore energy use, offshore aquaculture, or even onshore aquaculture, things like desalination, deep seabed mining, things like that. The third category is the ecosystem impacts of climate change. And then the fourth emerging challenge is recent policy measures that may weaken, reduce, or eliminate MPAs. Those of you who watch the news and are aware of the sort of changing proposed policies and governance structure, not only within the United States, but certainly it's an issue around the world. There are ocean policies and executive orders that have the potential to diminish or eliminate protections offered by MPAs. So these emerging challenges, either alone or in combination, can have pretty major effects. They can reduce biological populations, including rare, threatened, or endangered species. They could result in changing ecological community structure and biodiversity composition and dynamics, especially with the introduction of non-native species. We could see disrupted natural animal behaviors, including dislocation from normal habitats, altered natural soundscapes, and affected species such as marine mammals that rely on sound for feeding, mating, migrating, and predator avoidance, reduced water quality, including ocean acidification and hypoxia, damaged cultural resources or diminished value of the cultural heritage landscape associated with MPAs, impaired traditional or subsistence ocean uses, and reduced, through policy and budgetary actions, ability of US MPAs to address these and other challenges and their effectiveness. Next slide, please. So you've seen this slide before. Brian talked about it quite a bit in the beginning, but in order to ensure that US MPAs continue to achieve their statutory goals and to sustain and enhance the benefits they provide in the face of these mounting pressures, the MPA Federal Advisory Committee recommends a series of practical actions to be undertaken within federal MPA programs and administered by the Departments of Commerce and Interior and supported among non-federal ocean management agencies and partners. In order to sustain these ecological, social, and economic benefits, the Department of Commerce and Interior must exercise foresight, coupled with innovative technical management, partnership, and policy solutions to meet these challenges. So specifically, the departments must act on these recommendations through their respective federal MPA programs. So for the Department of Commerce and NOAA, Their relevant MPAs would include national marine sanctuaries, marine national monuments, and federal-state partnerships in national estuary and research reserves. For the Department of Interior, those MPAs would be national parks, marine national monuments, and national wildlife refuges. And additionally, and this is important, both departments should actively encourage and support the broad implementation of these recommendations with a wide array of non-federal MPA partner programs around the United States, including state, territorial, local, tribal, and indigenous agencies and communities. I think that, we really can't emphasize the importance of partnerships enough, and it's something that I think those who think about creating and adopting MPAs are increasingly thoughtful about, because you're just able to sort of leverage not only enforcement and monitoring resources, but buy-in and stewardship from communities by working together with non-federal partners. Next slide, please. So again, if we recognize the benefits the MPAs provide, and we also recognize the emerging challenges, and these challenges are not going away. We support increased tourism and recreation. It's also one of the values of MPAs. But of course, there's the potential to sort of love these ecosystems to death. Climate change is certainly on the horizon for the long term, and policies will always be subject to change based on leadership and changes in governance structure. So these challenges are not going away anytime soon. And if we want to support MPAs so that they can continue to fully realize their potential in the face of these challenges, then this is one of our key recommendations. And again, this is sort of related to the slide before, which Brian has already talked about a bit, but we want to fully support, fund, maintain, evaluate, and manage the MPA system that we have right now. And if there are proposed changes to MPAs, size, location, purpose, protection, or designation, that those changes be done thoughtfully, and that they are based on clearly articulated objectives with a rigorous evaluation of effectiveness, strong science, and a transparent and inclusive public planning process. We understand that some MPAs may need to be adaptively managed to address some of these challenges, knowing that there are lots of new uses for the ocean coming down the pike, and climate change may require some changes in some ways to some MPAs. But we urge MPA managers and the departments to ensure that any changes are made based on these criteria here, with very thoughtful science-based process. Next slide.
Okay, Charlie, do you like to do this or me?
Sure. I'll start, and then you can jump in if you see anything being left out.
All right.
So the question for us now, and it's true of any committee product, is what happens next. The intention of this whole exercise is to inform and ultimately influence the direction of MPA management in U.S. waters. So that's our next job, is to take the excellent work of the committee and its recommendations and to distribute them and socialize them, and to the extent we can, have them integrated into the thinking and actions of MPA agencies. So since the recommendations were submitted in late November, and then taking into account the holidays and the government shutdown, the things that we've done so far are to widely distribute the products through our own website, which I'll give the URL at the end of this presentation, and other organizations' website listservs. You've probably seen them floating around, and through various ocean organizations. So the facts story is out in the world now. We're also having the products formatted professionally, so they're a little easier to read and appreciate. So what's next is the actual moving closer to implementation phase. which is the whole point. So we are beginning a coordinated effort to reach out to NOAA's MPA programs and to those in the Department of Interior who are our partners in all of this, to take a hard look at the findings and recommendations and see which ones are applicable to their systems and what they might want to do about that. And that will be a gradual process, but the initial engagement will be critically important and we hope can happen soon. Similarly, we're proposing that the FAC leadership, primarily this group that's on the webinar right now, provide a briefing for NOAA and Department of Commerce and Department of Interior leaders at the policy level so that these ideas can become infused in the sort of higher level thinking and planning at the department level. We're also seeking to publish the products in various venues, including with our friends at MPA News, and distributing them in ocean related events like the Capitol Hill Oceans Week, which is coming up. So we're in now the phase where we're trying to enhance the chances that the recommendations are actually taken up and implemented by the target agency. And things are looking positive. We've had, I should mention, we've had consistent support from the very beginning from NOAA and the Department of Commerce and the Department of Interior for the committee and for their work on this charge. And I expect that will continue, and so we're going to take advantage of that willingness to consider these issues to see if we can actually leverage some of these ideas into action. So I think that's it for me. Brian, did you want to add something?
Just to say that it's my hope as former chair of the committee that this report become part of the national conversation on what we should be doing with these protected areas throughout the nation, and not just at the federal level, because as was pointed out repeatedly, this is dealing with marine protected areas which are at all levels of government and through tribal governments, et cetera. So I think this is a very important report. I think it says a lot. It is highly dependent on scientifically valid information, and I'm just hoping that it again becomes part of what is being considered with the future of our marine protected areas around the nation.
Great, and I'd like to just put in one plug for the committee itself. These are 20 people who've volunteered and invested a considerable amount of their own personal time for the common good. It's been a great group. They've done really excellent work, and I think we all owe them a debt of gratitude. Thank you.
Okay.
Excuse me one sec, just one
Sure.
point for everyone. I believe the report is available at the site at the base of this
That's
slide.
right.
Okay, just wanted to mention that.
Good. Yes, good point. All right, we're getting some questions coming in, and so thank you very much to Brian, Samantha, Mark, and Charlie. So I'm going to remind those listening that if you have questions, please feel free to use the Q&A or chat functions in your web interface to send in your questions. So we'll start with one that gets a little bit at what Samantha was just discussing with regards to adaptive management, and that is what efforts are being made to change the location of MPAs or expand them due to changes in the species distribution from environmental change?
This is Brian. That's a very good question, and I'm wondering maybe Charlie, if you could hit this kind of from the overview, and then I don't know whether Samantha has specific examples or not.
Sure. Yeah, that's a very good and timely question, and one that a lot of us are thinking about a lot. I think the short answer is that although the awareness is growing that that's something we all need to think through and potentially act on. The system, as many of you probably know, is a little sluggish in its reaction to changes like this. So I'm not aware of any ongoing efforts to substantially move the physical footprint of an MPA in U.S. waters. But there are certainly discussions going on and research going on. My impression is that when and if that does occur, it will be initially and primarily in MPAs that we put in the category of sustainable production, and that is those that have a focal species or resource that is of economic, primarily, or recreational interest, and that as that resource moves, so too might the MPA. But I think it's still early days, and there's a lot of discussion and analysis that needs to go into that, and probably some governance changes as well.
Hey, Charlie, this is Mark. Maybe I can add to that as well.
Please do.
This is a really important question, and it is, in fact, receiving a lot of attention in the science of MPA design in response to changing climates. And one of the key things to recognize is that most of these species shifts in distribution are well beyond the size of any given MPA. And so it really underscores, and what's sort of being, I think, the argument made in the scientific community is the value of networks of protected areas to accommodate those shifts in species distributions from one protected area to another as species are shifting along a coastline.
Yeah, and I would just follow up and say that, well, one, that there is a piece we did in 2017, a shorter piece we did on adaptive management that some folks on this webinar might find interesting, so feel free to take a look at that. But the other thing I would say, you know, in doing that piece, we talked a lot about just the importance of having really clear goals and objectives for MPAs, and that if you don't already have those, make sure you have them before you think about making any tweaks, you know, or adaptively managing your MPA, and that there just needs to be great care taken before adjusting boundaries or level of take, things like that. And it's certainly not something that should be undertaken without a lot of thought and best available science.
Very good.
Okay, great. We have another question that is asking if, say, the science of MPAs or the designation of MPAs is coupled with, say, other legislation. For example, the question is can you couple MPA designation with, say, the Clean Water Act in order to better position, say, them against a variety of potential threats such as environmental, anthropogenic policy to ensure their continued benefits for future generations?
This is Brian. I'll take a little stab at that, but others may want to chime in. I think when you've got a marine protected area, there are all sorts of different types of marine protected areas. They're absolutely not done in isolation of what is happening with regard to other major statutes dealing with water quality or pollution and what have you. And I think there are, I don't know if this is properly answering the question, but I think some of the MPAs are certainly designed around the activities that are happening as a result of those other statutes. But at times, I believe the existence of an MPA has influenced perhaps the way some of these other statutes have been executed. So for example, if you are protecting an area, but you are aware that there are serious water quality issues from non-point source pollution, the existence of that marine protected area off coast could help drive measures to reduce that non-point source pollution to provide greater productivity of that area. So I don't know if others on the panel have other thoughts on this.
Yeah, this is Samantha. So I would echo that. I think that's exactly right, Brian. And in fact, certainly in the California MPA process, a whole lot of thought was given to water quality, existing water quality areas of significant biological areas of, what is it? What is ASBS?
Areas of special biological
Significance. Yeah, there was a whole lot of care given to the idea that we have these existing state water quality areas, and what happens if we put a new state MPA adjacent to or on top of this. I'm not sure if this question came up because of what I mentioned about emerging challenges and potential threats to water quality. But that when I was talking about it was sort of a reference to the fact that with more industrial uses of the ocean, you can imagine there will certainly be more challenges related to water quality, just with more traffic, more fuel being burned, more potential for things like oil spills. But Brian's absolutely right. MPAs do not exist in a vacuum or in isolation, and laws like the Clean Water Act and OXLA and other important laws that govern our oceans and coasts will still apply inside MPAs in the same way that they do outside.
Great, thank you. Another question has come in that says, you mentioned the importance of engaging community members in MPA stewardship through the avenue of community or citizen science. And then you also discussed the data gap in understanding of resistance and resilience of marine organisms, for example, as they face the impacts of climate change and other stressors. Can you speak to the role that citizen science, such as the Limpets project, this person is familiar with the sanctuaries process, which is the long-term monitoring program and experiential training for students, the role that type of project could play in filling the data gaps and supporting adaptive management of our MPAs?
Yeah, this is Mark. Maybe I can respond to that.
Yep, please.
So Limpets is an excellent example. There's others as well. The Reef Check program, the Reef program that enlist citizen science scuba diving programs that are actually engaged, like Limpets, in the formal monitoring and evaluation of marine protected areas, especially for those examples along the coast of California. And it's the involvement of those citizen science groups, and especially given their how economical they are, that is going to probably contribute in very important ways to developing those long time series that will allow us to capture how these, both the protected ecosystems or species, as well as those outside of the protected areas, respond to changing environmental conditions. And then that'll allow us to continue to better evaluate the actual contribution of the protected areas to enhancing their resistance or resilience to those changes.
And I might just add, I've been very excited to see this kind of explosion of citizen science around the nation. And I think what has made it, I think historically, there was sort of a resistance to going that route because of quality control. And I think there are a variety of programs now which feed into these citizen science initiatives, so that the feeling is that the material that's being produced and the findings that they are coming up with are valid, which is exciting.
Excellent. We're getting some very good questions and discussion. Another one has come in that says they didn't mention, the speakers didn't mention commercial fisheries, and how do they fit into these reports?
I don't know. Well, let me go ahead and just mention that briefly, that we, with the marine protected areas that are put in place throughout the nation, there are various restrictions on all sorts of fishery operations, sport and commercial, from time to time. I don't know that we got into, I don't know, Charlie, maybe you want to help with this in terms of how we kind of dealt with that aspect of it.
Yeah, well, we didn't. And the reason, and it was kind of a judgment call at the time, but we all talked about this in the initial scoping session in San Francisco, was that that's a whole different, in many ways, set of questions and mechanisms and And we thought that the story of everything else needed to be told as well as the commercial fishing one, which is typically what a lot of the MPA discussion focuses on. So we kind of made a strategic choice to focus on the rest of the story of the benefits, recognizing that MPAs have all sorts of impacts on commercial fishing. In some ways they're restricting it. In some ways they may be actually advancing it through things like spillover. But that story is better known and also in some ways more complicated than some of the things that the committee chose to focus on here. So it's certainly it's an important question and one that we might want to look at separately in the future, but it was kind of carved out of this conversation.
Thank you. We have another question that says, given the current administration's desire for ocean governance to come from the state or regional level rather than the federal, how does the Federal Advisory Committee work with similar regional or site level organizations such as, say, sanctuary advisory councils?
Do you want me to take a crack at that, Brian?
Please.
Sure. So that's a very good question. And the answer is that the advisory committee has kind of been evolving in recent years in the way that they operate, the way that they engage stakeholders and other organizations. And we've been trying to do exactly what that question is implying, even before the recent rethinking about the scope and scale of ocean governance. And so, for example, the San Francisco meeting that Brian mentioned at the beginning of his talk, which was the kickoff for this charge, was held jointly and planned jointly and heavily integrated with the Sanctuary Advisory Council chairs. So for I think it was the second time, we met with them and sort of thrashed out some of these ideas in ways that were resonant with them as well as to our FAC. And then we pursued them on parallel tracks. And we've been, ever since then, interacting with them on some of these issues to try to see if we can find ways to kind of leverage what each of those two really quite different scales of interest are trying to do on these questions about benefits and challenges. So there's a growing recognition that there's some real value and power in that, and we're making real progress. I think what now we need to do is to look beyond the Sanctuary Advisory Councils to other groups that advise or cooperate with MPAs like the California Collaborative, as well as more broadly to regional ocean planning groups to try to bring that scale of consideration into what we do and vice versa. So I would say stay tuned on that, but that's a very timely question.
Okay, we're getting near the end, so I'm going to just say put the call out there one last time. And if there's any more questions you'd like to submit, you can use the chat or the Q&A. We've done our best to answer as many questions as we could. Let's see if there's any outstanding questions. What I'll do is I'll say, given the 5 recommendations, do the panelists have a sense of which of those recommendations represents the greatest challenge to the future management?
That's an interesting one. I mean, I think that this first recommendation, the overriding recommendation, is basically saying we see benefits of these areas and we want to see the Secretaries of Interior and the Secretaries of Commerce, we want to basically impress upon them the importance of these areas, and we hope that that reflects itself on their activities. And really, the majority of the recommendations that follow are kind of supporting that fundamental overriding one, which is basically saying these things are providing substantial benefits, and we hope you do whatever you can under the executive order and under your trust responsibilities to keep these areas vibrant and productive and working. So for me, the number one recommendation is the big umbrella, and everything falls beneath it. Number one doesn't work without the other recommendations being fully implemented. But anybody else have a comment?
Yeah, this is Charlie. I agree with that, but I also think that if you look at the others from the lens of which is going to be both the most impactful once we've addressed it and challenging to address, it seems to me that it's number two, ensuring compatibility of ocean uses, because those uses are changing right before our eyes in many cases and expanding rapidly and into areas that are often within current MPAs or in planned or imagined MPAs. And we really desperately need the tools to evaluate not just the impacts of the uses, but the compatibility of those impacts with the purposes of various kinds of MPAs. And I think that's a real challenge. And I think it's something that we're up to, but we're going to need to devote some time and resources to do it.
Agreed.
Okay, I think we're going to wrap it up. I want to say thank you to all those that sent in questions. I believe it's been a very thoughtful discussion. And I'd also like to thank our panelists, Brian, Samantha, Mark, and Charlie, for sharing their work and this information with us. Thank you very much, everyone. This concludes the webinar. Speakers, any other last thoughts?
Thanks for listening.
Yeah, thanks so much for the opportunity.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
Yeah, thank you. This was great.
Okay, thanks everybody. Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.